This is a podcast about new crops. You're going to love it. Join us on The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin.
As a farmer, you look at these sites and you see ground that you can use, right? And so every landowner that I talk to is like, hey, have you thought about growing soybeans in there or pumpkins? Or, I mean, you've heard it all, right? All these different specialty crops. And, Eric's team and Eric made a great point that having something that will be scalable when you're talking about 1,200 acres. We have a project that's 6,000 acres.
Welcome back to The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin. In this third and final episode on agrivoltaics, Will and I dig into what farming might look like on agrivoltaic sites. We first talked to Sarah Moser of Savion Energy, a solar development company, and Eric Romich of Ohio State University on large-scale agrivoltaic projects that they're collaborating on together. And then we talked to Brad Heins, a professor of dairy management and extension specialist at the University of Minnesota, about his research on grazing cattle underneath solar panels. Let's jump right in.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Moser from Savion. I'm the Director of Farming Operations and Agrivoltaics. I'm actually a farmer as well in Northwest Ohio. We farm about 1,500 acres. I farm with my dad and my brother and my husband. So family farm, corn, wheat, and soybeans. We actually added livestock to the operation. So we're doing it all right now. I do live in a wind farm, and we have had some people sign us up for solar as well. So we're familiar with that on the farming side of the house. And then, of course, I'm doing development and working with Savion to bring the two together. So that's me.
Excellent. Eric, who are you?
Good afternoon, Will, and thanks for having me. My name's Eric Romich. I'm a Ohio State University Extension Field Specialist for Energy Education. So I've been with Extension since 2008, and I started as a county-based extension educator, and really in that county role, kind of had my first experience with renewable energy development and working with at the time, what we thought was a massive project, right? An 85-acre solar field in the county. And so that was kind of my first exposure to renewable energy development, and, taking a look at kind of the good, bad, and otherwise, and how those projects impact communities in various ways. And so since that time, I guess in 08 and in 2012, I moved into this statewide position where I just focus solely on energy education now, and I get pulled into really everything from oil and gas development and in the eastern part of the state to wind up in the northwest, and utility scale solar development all across the state. Over the years, we've done a lot of financial modeling for farmers that were interested in putting solar in on their farm to power their operations behind the meter. So really get kind of pulled into a lot of different aspects within energy, and certainly since I'd say 2016, utility scale solar development has really been the topic that's drawing the most attention right now here in Ohio.
Sounds like you've got a lot of projects going on, but today we want to focus on one specific project, and that is this Between the Rows project that you have as a partnership between Savion Energy and Ohio State. Eric, can you speak a little bit more about the research that's currently underway with this project Between the Rows?
Yeah, and this is a really exciting project that it's been something our team here at OSU has been looking at for a while, and we've had 3 or 4 attempts at getting this type of research off the ground, and just didn't quite have the right partnerships in place to have things work. But really, essentially, what we're looking at, and what really starts the whole interest in agrivoltaics is, as we look across the state, and not just in Ohio, but the Midwest in general, there's just so much utility scale development right now, and any energy source is going to have strengths and weaknesses. That's the one thing I could say traveling the state is everybody's favorite source of energy is the one that's generated somewhere else. And, when we look at solar, the one weakness as we've seen these projects scale up is that they have a large footprint, right? It takes a lot of horizontal surface area to generate the power. And so, we were trying to explore what types of multi-land use options exist within within the parameters of two key points. So is it economical? Because we want something that the industry will adopt, right? So this gets commercialized and put into practice. And is it scalable? Can this be a solution that can scale up to thousands and thousands of acres? And so I try and really highlight that point that we're not discounting other agrivoltaic practices, but we were really focused on what can we scale up and what can be economical. So our team at OSU was really interested in forage production, and obviously we have some forage specialists on our team. But as we were kind of putting together the parameters of a research project, obviously we needed a partner for a site, and that's when we kind of partnered with Sarah and Savion, and through the Between the Rows partnership with Savion, we were able to identify a research site that allowed us to quickly just answer a couple of questions. And so, and I guess that's your back up one step. The reasoning for this is we can't wait to get results, right? Like we need to get seeds in the ground now. And so we were just trying to find a site that was available. And that's, Sarah was able to provide one of those for us through this collaboration. And so we really wanted to initially look at this and say, what are the best practices for establishment? Does it grow? And what's the quality? Like that's kind of our first step at, if we can understand that, then we can kind of look at scaling this up and more of a commercial scale, kind of in a phase two. But kind of that first step is, we don't even know the recommended seeding rate. We don't know how the crops are impacted by portions of the alley that may be in full sun versus full shade. And so those were some of the things that we looked at. And so, the project that was put together, we essentially developed 12 test plots within an existing solar farm that's at the hog farm there at Pigtails LLC in Van Wert. And each of those is roughly, I think, 16 by 21 or 16 by 22 feet. So small test plots, but within each of those, we had a couple of variables. We had variable seeding rates. So if you could imagine, at this research site, we have essentially 3 alleys. So an alley being, that space in between 2 solar arrays, right? That you can visualize running equipment down. So we had 3 alleys, and each of those was a separate seed mix. So we had a cool season hay mix in the first alley, alfalfa in the second alley, a mixture of, I guess we'll just say cover crops at this point in the third alley, and then we had our control zone that was outside of the solar arrays. And then with each of those seed varieties, we had varying seeding rates. So we did 75% of the recommended rate, 100% of the recommended rate, and 125% of the recommended seeding rate. And then the final kind of cross section there would be, as mentioned, this is a fixed tilt system. So there's portions of these alleys that experience pretty intense shade, whereas the other half, or I should say 2/3, experience full sunlight exposure. So kind of monitoring the differences in shade versus sun as well is something that we were really interested in. And so we're sitting here now. We've completed kind of 2 growing seasons. So we had our establishment year, and then in year 2, we really got some really good data in terms of the forage quality and how the crops were producing. So.
Great. We'll get back to what those kind of results were saying here in a second. Sarah, anything to add to that? I know that you're kind of, you're doing the haying side of things, but you're also really interested in growing crops, corn and beans under these solar panels. So I'm curious where things stand with that.
Yeah, for sure. So first, like as a farmer, you look at these sites and you see it and you see ground that you can use, right? And so every landowner that I talk to is like, hey, have you thought about growing soybeans in there or pumpkins? Or, I mean, you've heard it all, right? All these different specialty crops. You see them doing it out in Colorado. You see them doing it places where they're trying different things. And, Eric's team, and Eric made a great point that having something that will be scalable when you're talking about 1,200 acres. We have a project that's 6,000 acres. I mean, so when you have that much space, that's a lot of tomatoes, that's a lot of cucumbers if you go out and you do produce. And so it's even, you see grazing everywhere. It's a lot of sheep. So Eric's solution and Ohio State's solution of forage crop in this hay and this alfalfa really made sense and resonated with me, because one, we got to feed all of those sheep if we do start a market for it when we do the grazing on solar sites. But then, my heart definitely lies with the soybean and corn. So, Eric mentioned the site is on our farm, and we maybe have planted an alleyway in soybeans. I've actually got corn growing in one right now. So I'm testing a little bit outside. The Ohio State project is done because we've kind of moved up and moved to a different or a bigger project. So I can kind of play with it a little bit the way that, I'm able to. And I won't lie, I took my 20-foot drill down through there and we got stuff growing. So we know it grows and we're working on it. But it's interesting and it's wonderful to have Ohio State involved, and that you guys are doing this with your extension agencies, because as a farmer we know it'll grow, but we need that research and we need those numbers and that data and everything to go with it to prove the science behind it and say, yeah, we know it'll grow, but we can prove it will grow, and we see the numbers and the crude proteins and what's coming out of it. So that's kind of help establish the story to the people that need to make the investment to go bigger, right?
Yeah, I can kind of add to that a little bit, Sarah. One of the things that, and when I say our team, I'm including Sarah in that. I mean, she's part of our research team and this effort, and as we kind of brainstorm, what are the opportunities, what are the challenges. I've started to kind of use the phrase hay ready solar site. Ultimately, like, this isn't something that we're suggesting, hey, this is just a drop-in solution that just move along, do things as normal, business as usual. And if you want to grow forages, go do that. Right. It's not how this is going to work. And so it's kind of this chicken or the egg scenario, right? Where do we start? And that's where I think that we have to have a good handle on establishment, quality, yields, that we could do some, ultimately, we're not there yet, but ultimately do some sound economic modeling to say, yeah, here's the potential. From that point, then, developers will need to have these considerations to say, well, what do we need to do to make a site that a farmer is willing to come in and manage for us on a commercial scale? And with that, when I say hay ready solar site, I mean, I'm thinking of things such as alleyways. Like, Sarah mentioned, there's 6,000 acre site in Ohio. So you don't want to do 6,000 acres of forages and have your alley widths as such that you're doing a full cut on the way down and a partial coming back over 6,000 acres, right? So those types of considerations, as you think about, what does the safe operation of equipment look like at a commercial scale, and how can we design these systems so that it has that in mind, right? That's not to say that there might not be some drop-in solution potential where you could, hey, this is a good fit. It can be done here. But, I think moving forward, we want to get to a point where we can kind of fine tune this and say, look, here are the turn radiuses that are necessary. Here are recommended alley widths or multipliers that you might look at for standard equipment in different alley situations. And at the end of the day, it's going to require that the ag sector and the solar sector start talking a little bit more.
Sarah, did you have anything to add in terms of the design of these solar installations? When you're thinking about co-locating them with agriculture, like what do you have to design differently from a solar installation that doesn't do agriculture?
Right. So, well, that's a great question. And I think that part of what we're doing with Ohio State now is going to help answer that. What we're seeing a lot with this project specifically, or well, as we move into the next project, is we're looking into precision ag, right? And there's so much technology out there right now that we can work with a lot of the designs. So really what it's coming into is that pre-planning and just that best practices, that thinking like a farmer ahead of time and realizing that you're not just slapping in some solar panels, right? That you're, and this is where it's important, where we're investigating forage, but also other crops, because Savion has a portfolio across the nation, right? We're building projects in Wisconsin and in Arizona, different crops, different, climates to worry about or consider, different equipment that we want to operate. So it's really project specific and looking at, well, what do they want to do here? What does this community value? What do they want to see happen with their solar project? And then being able to take it back to my engineers and say, here's the possibilities. We could raise the panels, we could bury the cable, we could, make the alleyways wider. We could, leave different areas for different things. And so I think it's thinking like a farmer. It's turning that, solar industry into realizing that, hey, we're working with the land. We really are solar farmers, right? And we need to think that way of what's best for the land and what's going to leave it in the best condition as we move forward.
And speaking of siting places in Wisconsin, we are the dairy state. That's what we do. We make hay. Is one big thing that we do, which is why I wanted to talk to you all, because looking at how do we optimize hay production in utility solar sites could have huge implications for a lot of these solar sites in Wisconsin. And I want to check in with you, Sarah, and see how your beans are doing right now. But I do want to see kind of what are the results that have come out of this research so far.
So, I can kind of give you a high level overview on some of our preliminary results. Christine, who's our forage specialist here at OSU Extension, is kind of she's working through trying to get those results cleaned up and into a technical report that we can kind of share here in the short, not too distant future, I guess I'll say. But in general, like as we look at the alfalfa, focusing in on, say, crude protein, most of our samples were grading out as, I should say all of them were above premium, and most of them, just over half, were above prime levels when you think about percentage of crude protein. So we were kind of in a range of 19 to 26%. Similar results when you look at alfalfa by relative feed quality. Most everything was above premium, kind of in a range of 146 to 156. So, and those are year 2 readings. So that's kind of excluding the establishment year as I kind of share those ranges. And very similar results when we looked at the cool season hay mix. So the one thing I will say is, and again, these are all kind of lessons learned as we move through this and think about what it looks like on a commercial scale. A couple of the obstacles that we did face with our establishment year, we really had a lot of foxtail that was kind of crowding out our cool season mix. We were able to spray the alfalfa and kind of get that back on track, but we really just had to kind of mow down the hay and kind of cross our fingers going into year 2. We were kind of hoping that it would come in, and it did really kind of bounce back good in year 2. But again, I think all but one of our year 2 samples were, when you look at it in terms of percentage of crude protein, I think it's all but one of our samples came in above premium, and about half of them came in above prime. So kind of think of a range like 18 to 26%. And then with your relative feed quality, kind of that 146 to 154 was kind of the range of results that we saw with again, most of those grading out above premium.
How did the biomass production compare between the shade, the ones under the solar panels, and out in the sun?
So in terms of like the actual results, to say like here's what the yields were, I don't necessarily have that data in front of me, but I will say that visually the forages that were in the full shade zone had kind of that deeper green, more lush kind of appeal to them, and it appeared to be a little bit thicker. Again, I don't have like the yield results in front of me, but our initial thought was that that would really not perform well. And kind of as we looked at, I was like, well, there's actually, possibly some advantages to that. And so as you think about the difference, and that was a shade zone that was kind of consistent. Your utility scale projects have single axis trackers, so it's going to be a little bit more evenly dispersed, right, and not as intense and kind of focused into one area. So that might actually be something that could benefit, and that's something that we're going to really kind of zero in on our phase 2 research is how does the shade being more evenly dispersed with a single axis tracker system impact this. But the last thing I'd say in terms of shade versus full sun is there seem to be less weed pressure in that area as well.
Oh, interesting. Sarah, how are your beans looking?
The beans look good. So I was looking at the numbers because Eric said he didn't have them in front of him. I got the Ohio State, the slideshow that we did here in front of me, and it looks like first cutting 58%, second cutting 62%. So good and prime there on your biomass. So it was good news all around, right? And that's what I'm hearing now is like solar's superpower is shade. Shade is protecting the plants. With the soybeans, we're seeing like a broader leaf development, right? Because it's just like the sun's not beating down on it, right? And like baking them out. So shade's been a good thing.
So it sounds like, yeah, good, like you said, good news all around, but I'm sure there have been some challenges that you faced along the way. Can you just kind of speak to what some of those have been, some of the major challenges?
Oh boy. Well, I will say some of my biggest critics are farmers. So, of course, every farmer's the best farmer in the world, and they can tell you how to do it better or that you can't do it like they can, right? So I've had people tell me, oh, hay won't grow here, or that won't work, or, I've pretty much anything out there that just, I think it's at first they didn't accept hybrids, right? They didn't accept hybrid seed back in the day. And we had to plant, hybrid seed in with our kids, and the kids would grow it in the plot in the backyard. And when it outgrew daddy's corn, he realized he better start growing hybrids, right? So I think it's just that attitude of change where, it will require a different type of farming. We've been used to clearing out fence rows, for the last 100 years and making the biggest possible field we can, and giant equipment. We all want to run these huge planters and these bigger corn heads or bigger, draper heads on our equipment. And it's like, no, maybe we need to go back to a little bit smaller equipment, maybe some autonomous equipment, and I think that's going to improve soil compaction. That's going to help us with a lot of different things. But that farmer mindset might be one of the bigger challenges I see, which, I said I work with my dad. So, you get that as a farmer all the time. As far as the industry goes, I got to say, Savion has been wonderful. They've been very progressive and forward thinking with agrivoltaics, and they've allowed me a lot of reign to try things. So I appreciate that. But farmers get things done. We figure out solutions. And so though there are challenges, I feel like we've been able to overcome a lot of those, and especially with the help of Ohio State and the universities to provide that academic support on what we're trying to do.
You mentioned a little bit about the big equipment and, maybe we need to go smaller. And I'm just curious, have you been having to use specialized equipment of any sort? And for the hay, are you trying to do dry hay, or are you bagging it?
That's a great question. So right now we're using the equipment that we have. And you'll find, a lot of farmers still have that conservation planter in the barn somewhere. We're doing our filter strips with something smaller, or we're working, the smaller fields with something still, so you can find it. But as we're moving into a field of growing agrivoltaics, we're hearing Kubota's a partner on our grant that Eric will talk about later, and they're looking at smaller equipment that will work between the rows. Because when you get up to 6,000 acres, you're not going to want to run a 20-foot drill through there, right? It's a little tight. You want to have something that's specialized for it. So, and then the autonomous equipment makes so much sense. And all of our kids, they love video games and robots, right? So like getting them excited about this next generation of farming that's happening is playing into this precision ag equipment and some of these solutions we're finding. So I think starting out, it'll be a mix of both. I've got a hay bind that goes down through the rows, right? And it's just a regular thing you got parked, here on the farm. So it'll be a transition time. I think we're all learning, and I think that it will work a little bit both ways starting out. So hope that answers your question, Will.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, for the hay, is it something that you're trying to dry out underneath the panels, or is it, you're bagging it at higher moisture?
Right. So we let it dry on the site, on the between the rows site. We let it dry. We raked it. We did all of that. It actually got rained on once. And so we had to rake it up and get it ready again. But we've talked about the solution of wet wrapping, because if there's a case where, with your single axis tracker, you make hay when the sun shines, and that's when I need my resource for my solar panels, right? So I'm not going to want to turn them and make the row wider during the day. So the solution would be, of course, go ahead and cut and wet wrap it in the evening, late evening, when the sun isn't something you're not going to lose the resource. So that's where, again, working with the solar company and finding solutions there. I was recently in Israel, and they're looking at a lot of the different times of day and how the shading, Next Tracker works with some of the, the position of the sun in the sky, those kind of things. And I think those will be solutions you'll see in agrivoltaics moving forward here.
Eric, did you have anything you wanted to add to that in terms of challenges that you faced?
Yeah, I think Sarah kind of had a pretty good summary of that. I mean, we touched early that one of the challenges was weed control, right? So we had some foxtail that was an issue in our establishment year for the cool season test plots. The other thing I guess I'd say would timing and weather, right? I mean, those those are difficult to predict and control. And so our cover crop test plots, I mentioned at the beginning that we had an alleyway for cover crops. We didn't really get any good data from those test plots, because we tried teff grass initially, and that didn't take. And then we came in later and tried to do a crimson clover, and that got washed out. So we have some pictures of our test plots where literally looks like a pond. So where we're supposed to have crimson clover germinating. And so that was, those were some challenges for sure. And I think that just when you try to scale that up, then what does that look like, right? So I still think that there's a lot of questions logistically to how does this look when we go out of this small proof of concept research and into a more commercialized application, and what do the logistics of that look like?
Just to follow up on that, how close are we to being able to roll this out on a large scale commercially?
Well, I guess I can kind of take that. I'm not sure if it's something that you guys are aware of up there, but we have utilized this data and kind of packaged into a Department of Energy proposal that was recently awarded. So we're kind of in the final negotiation phases of that award. So we haven't technically started yet, but we're the project's been awarded. We're kind of working with DOE to kind of dot the I's, cross the T's, and get a start date. But I think that once we get through that research, the first couple of years of that research, I think it'll tell us a lot in terms of how ready we are to say, here's how you go about best management practices to establish these forage systems in 1,000-acre or Sarah 6,000-acre site, right? But that DOE project, we're really kind of look at it as 4 kind of core buckets of research focus. And our first is to kind of get replication on our forage crop production. So take what we learned with our test pilot plots and put those into more of a commercial application. So we'll have like 35 acres of our test plots that are under glass there, and then of course control zones. And again, that's going to get to that point of, you know, how different are the results based on the construction practices or construction impact, right? The other thing that we're looking at is complementary grazing, and so, you know, Brady Campbell, who's our sheep grazing specialist here at OSU, you know, Brady has been contacted by, I would say, every solar developer on the East Coast, talking about, you know, grazing these sites. And it's like, there's not enough animals in North America to graze all the solar you guys want to put in Ohio. And so, you know, one of the things that we were looking at, though, is, you know, if we can mechanically harvest most of the site, and then obviously there's going to be strips next to the post that you don't want to get too close with equipment. So, you know, he's going to be doing some research with kind of, I guess we've kind of tagged complementary grazing. So we'll come in and harvest a zone, and then he'll come in and kind of target graze that area to clean up around the post and so forth, where we don't get too close with the equipment. And of course, he's going to be looking at, you know, animal behavior and health and weight gain and you know, equipment and how you actually manage those herds within the zone. So that's our second bucket. The third area Sarah's touched on, and that's precision agriculture. So really looking at, you know, how do we utilize precision ag and digital technology to optimize the management of these sites. You know, as you look at thousands and thousands of acres potentially that we could be, you know, have potential to grow forage crops on. And so, again, Kubota's our partner on this DOE project with that, and we have Dr. Shear here at OSU Ag Engineering kind of taking lead on that aspect. And then the last one is soil health, and that's one where, you know, we're really excited to better understand what does the site look like post construction, right? So we have compaction samples all across the site, and a lot of compaction samples in our research zone, looking at, you know, what were the compaction levels of this site as it's existed in a corn soybean rotation over the years. And we'll come in post construction and get a comparative reading to see, okay, so how bad was the disturbance, and then from there, you know, what series of cover crops could we use to help, you know, expedite the, you know, decompaction of those sites coming out of construction. So, you know, thinking of, you know, some deep tap rooted type cover crops that could help break up those topsoils and get them ready to put back into production. But yeah, that's one of the areas, and Sarah sees this as well. I mean, it seems like when you hear people talking about solar at this magnitude, the biggest negative you hear is, oh, you're taking good prime farmland out of production. And on the other end of that, you hear, well, we can put it right back into production when we're done. And I think the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, but we don't really know, right? We don't know what the impact to the site is, but to just say that, well, we can't farm it again, I think is, you know, let's get some data to see. And, you know, I think the ability to look at this on the construction side will give us the right management practices when you do look at kind of end of project life or decommissioning, right? So if we can identify strategies to decompact the soils using cover crops and different rotations after they construct it, it's a very similar process to take it out, right? So then we can kind of apply that on the back end of these projects to help get them back into some type of production sooner rather than later.
Well, all of that sounds pretty dang exciting. It sounds like we're going to have to check back in a couple years to see how this much larger project is going, and updates from that. Well, is there anything that you all would like to add here at the end, in the last couple minutes we have left?
I don't think you should wait that long to check in. Well, I think you need to come sooner. So hopefully we'll be seeding, you know, depending on how the DOE awards go. You know, we're thinking this fall here to get the hay and alfalfa out so that we'll have something growing and have something for you to look at and come down and see and visit us. I know a lot of people head out to Farm Science Review in Ohio. We might not be ready by September. It's September 19, 2021 this year, but maybe next year everyone needs to come to London, Ohio and stop out and see Madison Fields. So, and then we keep mentioning this 6,000 acre project. You know, when that baby gets out there, we're going to be doing some real cool stuff. So it's exciting. It really is. And I tell all those farmers out there, instead of fighting it or saying it's not going to work, figure out how to be a part of it, and whether it's sheep or even dairy cows, it doesn't have to be under the panels. There's so much buffer area involved with these sites. Maybe you need grazing, maybe there's a solution there. Cooney pigs, people are grazing those. So there's lots of different solutions for these projects, and farmers all have a side hustle. So they need to keep their ears open and their brains turning for ways to be involved, because this is something that's happening and it's exciting.
Great. Eric, any last thoughts?
No, I mean, I would just echo Sarah's enthusiasm. I mean, this is something that, as I mentioned, I've been working, Christine and I've been trying to get this off the ground since like 2015, 2016, right? We've had 3 or 4 different sites along the way that it's like, okay, this is going to happen. It's not going to happen. And so, finding a partnership where, they're truly interested in how can we do this better? And I think that that's a question we should all be asking ourselves. I mentioned, earlier in the podcast as we kicked this off, everybody's favorite form of energy is one that's generated somewhere else, right? All of these different sources have their flaws, and there's no kind of silver bullet that this is our solution. And it's okay to say that out loud. And sometimes I feel like people cringe when it's like, oh, well, this is a weakness of solar. It's okay, right? There's a challenge. So how can we try and address that? How can we try to minimize that? And that's what we're doing here. Is the weakness is it takes up a lot of horizontal surface area. But what we're trying to do is find ways that we can still have that as productive ground that can be feeding into multiple industries. It kind of eliminates some of that, pinning food versus energy against one another. And so, I think there's a lot of potential here, but the thing that is really going to be critical moving forward is to make sure that, we can identify these little challenges and hiccups along the way and start to kind of flush them out so that we can say, here's your guide to doing this on a commercial scale. Here are the things you really got to look for as it relates to, operating equipment in these zones, or, design considerations on the developer's end so that we can get equipment through the alleys, right? I mean, that's that's a major deal. When Sarah called me at one point and said, I don't know, we're going to not bury this DC cable. And it's like, well, we can't run tractors through the alley if the cables are there. And so those types of challenges they're real and they happen every day. But at the same time, it's that awareness, it's that communication that can say, look, here's what we can do. How can we work together to make this happen? And demonstrating that it can actually be done on a commercial scale. And then when we get the economics, I think it's really going to change some things.
Well, Sarah and Eric, thanks for coming on today. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
And now we're going to dive into our conversation with Brad Heins from the University of Minnesota to talk about grazing cattle underneath solar panels.
Brad, can you give an introduction to yourself and an idea of what led you to agrivoltaics in the first place and some of the research that you're doing?
Sure. So I'm a professor of dairy management at the University of Minnesota, and I'm actually located at the West Central Research and Outreach Center. So I'm about 2.5 hours west of Minneapolis and St. Paul, where the main campus is. So even though my home is technically in the Department of Animal Science in the Twin Cities, I live and work out at a research center where we have 300 cow dairy, 1,000 acres of land, where we do research on pasture-based dairying and everything that surrounds dairy production here in Minnesota. We really got into agrivoltaics with some of our early research probably 10 years ago. We had an idea to monitor our dairy herd here for energy usage. So we put a whole bunch of sensors on motors, fans. We started monitoring water usage. So we know exactly how much water we use, how much energy, every little fan uses. And vacuum pump, milk pump, you name it, to get an idea of what our farm uses for energy. I should say we also have pigs here. So we have probably 60 sows, farrow to finish. And we have been monitoring the hogs as well. So it's kind of a farm system-wide initiative that we have to sort of make our dairy farm and cropping operation sort of carbon neutral, I guess. So it sort of led us in that we have all this monitoring information from our dairy. Then I actually got a research project where we started monitoring on farms. So we went to 5 Minnesota farms that ranged from 200 cows to 10,000 cows and did the same thing, monitored all the energy usage to see what farms were using for energy and water on farms, so we could apply kind of renewable energy technologies, whether that's wind turbines or solar panels. And so once we got all that energy usage, we started moving into agrivoltaics. In Minnesota here, there was quite a few people grazing sheep under solar panels. And, you know, I know Wisconsin as well. I grew up along the Wisconsin border, and Minnesota. There is not a lot of sheep in Minnesota to be able to handle all the solar installations that were going up. So it was kind of our idea. Well, why don't we put cows under it and see what happens? Nobody's really ever done that, and so that sort of led us down that path. And we put up a solar installation and decided to throw some cows under it. So very unscientific.
Sometimes that's the way it works. Unscience leading to science.
That's right. That's right. So it was kind of a long road to get us to solar, but we've been pretty fortunate to be able to put up some solar installations.
Yeah. So what have you found in the meantime? Do you think agrivoltaics is well suited for dairies? Yeah. How are the cows doing under the panels?
Sure. Yeah. The cows are doing well, and it's worked out well for us. When we first started, we really thought about the cows and can they damage the panels? What can they do to wreck them? Which is actually the first thing that most people think of when you put up solar panels and cows. I probably get 5 to 6 emails a week from people with probably that same question about are the cows going to wreck the solar panels if I put cows under it? And we thought of all of those ideas. So we actually put the panels about 8 feet up. It was not really scientific at all. I went out and found the tallest cow in our herd and then decided how far can she, reach in the air with her tongue, and let's put the panels at that height. So that's sort of how we settled on 8 feet. Very unscientific way to figure out how to put up solar panels, but we decided that 8 feet was tall enough based on, we had poles and structures and stuff to think about as well. Our first solar installation that we put up was 30 kW, so it's 2 banks of 15 kilowatts, where we put them 8 feet in the air, and we concreted all the poles in the ground, so 6 feet down, which was probably a little overkill actually, because we just didn't know what the cows were going to do. So we decided to make it sturdy enough so if cows were rubbing on it or pushing on it, it probably wasn't going to wreck it. We probably built it hurricane strength actually, and since then we've learned that we probably don't need that as much structure on the panels.
Do you find that the cows are rubbing up against the solar panels at all?
When we first put the cows out there, the first couple days, they maybe sniffed around it, tried to rub on it, tried to lick the solar panels in the air. But, but really after that, we just don't see them. Once in a while they rub up against it, but they just don't do it that often. So we haven't had any issues with cows under our solar panels, with rubbing or wrecking everything. So we we actually put all the wiring and the racking up underneath the solar panels so that the cows can't reach the wires. One thing that we also thought of, so our panels are in a pasture, so for pasture based cows, and we put the solar inverters outside of the fence. So the cows can't bother the inverters either, and that's, maybe one thing that people might not think about is, don't put the inverters right next to the panels like we see in a lot of installations. So they probably have to be outside, or if you are going to have the inverters where the cows can get them, you probably have to fence around it so they stay away from that. But that's what we found in all of our installations, is just move the inverters outside of the fence, and you won't have any issue there either.
Have you done anything with the spacing of the panels? Is it, have you spaced them out further in order to facilitate forage production underneath it, or is it pretty standard as far as the spacing goes between the panels themselves on the racking and then between the rows?
It's pretty standard, actually. There may be 25 feet apart or more between the two different rows, and we've kept it at that just because, to facilitate pasture growth. We also wanted to get some shade, so it does cast some shade for the cows. That was our ultimate goal, was to provide shade for animals that were outside. But we really haven't modified anything out of normal, except raising them in the air, compared to what you probably would see in a large solar installation in the upper Midwest here.
Do you find that the cattle do take advantage of the shade under the panels?
They do. On a hot day, you will see them underneath the solar panels. They're all standing there, in the shade. Sometimes they're laying in the shade. Yes, they do utilize it a lot, especially when it gets hot and the sun is beating down on them. They utilize that, and it's been good for us. We had a graduate student, Kirsten Sharp. She did her master's degree on looking at how the behavior of cows and how it can help reduce heat stress in cows. And we actually found that it does reduce heat stress. It lowers their body temperature by about a half a degree Fahrenheit or so when the cows are underneath the shade. So, and they use it. They use the shade during the hot part of the day. We had this 30 kW system, which is pretty small. It would be maybe what some farmers would probably use for agrivoltaics. We only we could probably put 80 cows underneath this 30 kW system pretty easily. We've also expanded, and in 2021, we built another one in our pasture. It's a 240 kilowatt system, so a much larger system that we could probably put 200 cows or 250 cows underneath that. We did the same thing, put it 8 feet in the air, the inverters outside of the pasture, but this time we didn't use any concrete. We just sunk the poles in 6 feet into the ground, and that was it. And we just haven't had any issue outside of that. So some of our lessons learned were we didn't need to go overkill on on our solar panels, because the cows really weren't going to bother them at all.
Right. Probably the cold metal is not as much a satisfying scratching post as a tree or something like that. They're
That's
like,
right.
well, this is smooth. This is not giving me any type of satisfaction.
Exactly.
For the when the cows, you said that they reduces their body temperature, they have less heat stress when they're out under there. And in the end, I mean, does that affect the milk production at all? I mean, are you seeing like a requisite increase in the milk production because of the less stress, or are you getting less forage production because they're under the shade, the forages that are there, and therefore, they're not maybe intaking as much, as there's not as much feed available?
Sure. That's a good question. And we didn't really find any difference in milk production for our cows when they were underneath the shade, underneath the solar panels. However, one issue that we had was our solar panels were stationary. So
Mm.
in our grazing cows, they were only maybe allowed those in the shade maybe 10 days out of the month, and then they went somewhere else because we were rotationally grazing them. So they really had a short period of time. So we really couldn't get a good handle on milk production because they went somewhere else that didn't have shade. And so it kind of defeated our whole purpose on trying to find milk production anyways. As far as the forages go, we didn't allow them to be underneath the solar panels for more than like I said, a week or 10 days, because I felt that they might create some either mud holes if it rains. They could damage the forage enough where it didn't grow back. So we gave the grass and stuff a rest so it would grow back under the panels, and we didn't wreck it. And it the forage and it grew back quite well. No problems, as long as we gave it a rest, and the cows weren't allowed to just keep trampling it the whole time.
What are you seeing now? I mean, in Wisconsin, in southern Wisconsin, we're in last week's severe drought now,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks really dry in a lot of the pastures, and there's a
Yeah.
lot of dry grass. I don't know, it's probably not as dry for you all as it is here, but I can't imagine that the rains have been enormous there and nothing here.
Right.
And so have you seen like those cool season grasses that I imagine are probably growing under those solar panels and at your station? Are they doing better than those that are not under the panels?
We have been kind of in a drought here. We haven't had as much rainfall as well. So the grasses are growing slowly under the panels, but they are growing. However, one thing that we've noticed is if the grass or whatever it might be is in shade, it grows much better than when it's in sort of full sunlight, especially during the drought. So the shade is sort of helping the grass stay in a vegetative state and grow much better without all of that direct sunlight. And that was one thing that we noticed, even when we've been working on this project for maybe a couple years now, looking at different forages. And I was surprised to see that in the shade, the grasses are doing so much better than in the direct sunlight. I didn't realize that would happen at all. So it was kind of neat to see that.
So you're not seeing as much of a summer slump in those forages.
Correct. That's right.
Yeah, and they're
That's
not
right.
heading out. Wow. Is there specific forages that you all have kind of found that are like, beam, these are what we're doing, these are really, really great under the panels?
For us, actually probably the best one so far is orchard grass is doing quite well.
Yeah.
Under the panels, it really grows well. Meadow fescue is done well. And we've had some mixtures too. Fescue or orchard grass and red clover seems to do well in a mixture underneath solar panels. So I think, and we have some of these, all by themselves. If you grow, red clover by itself seems to do okay too. But the orchard grass by far is the best producing one. You give it some shade and it just keeps growing with no problem.
I wanted to ask about the type of fencing that you use.
So our panels are within a pasture. So we have, 3 high tensile wires that keep the cows in. If we want to fence out our cows from the panels or what you name it, we just use a poly wire, a small electric poly wire, and our cows don't really bother much of anything. So once they're trained to a fence, they learn to respect it.
Okay. And then, so what are you seeing as some of the hurdles to adoption for this type of system?
I think the biggest thing right now that I see or hear from people that I talk with, all over the world, is one of the big things is, can we grow cattle? Can we raise cattle underneath solar panels? Are they going to wreck the panels? Or are they going to destroy it? And I've usually, can answer that question pretty quickly. We've had our solar panels up for going on 5 years now, and we haven't had any issue. The other one is probably cost. Right now, if I think back to when we first put the first installation in 2017, 2018. We didn't have certain, inflationary cost. Actually, there was very little cost increase by putting the panels 8 feet in the air versus 2 or 3 or 4 feet in the air. So we were about $3 a watt for our solar installations. Now if you were going to do it and raise it 8 foot, steel costs are increased. You probably would have a little more cost to put them in the air. So cost is probably one of the big things that people think about. One other thing that we have thought about here is, so what do you do with all the energy that you produce? Depending on your farm size, will you use it all? Will you put it on the grid? What is the business model of the farm to sell that power, or is it to use it? And we actually use all of our energy that we produce. We actually part of our goal was to have a solar installation that can power a DC fast charger and have an electric vehicle on farm. And we have all of that. So our solar panels are producing power for the dairy, but also utilizing some for a fast charger that charges electric vehicles as well.
Very cool.
One other thing that we think about from a solar installation and either grazing, and it's sort of applicable to whether it's dairy or beef or sheep or you name it. If you have a stationary system, you probably won't have the livestock in there for long-term effects, because otherwise they do damage to the grass and cause all of those issues. So we're actually developing our own portable solar shade system. So it's going to be 30 kilowatts, and we're going to make it portable so we can it's more kind of going off grid power system. We'll have some battery storage on it. We'll be able to charge. We have an electric tractor coming, so we'll be able to charge an electric tractor with it, as well as pull this solar 30 kilowatt system around our pasture so the cows can have shade at all times. So we're, and we can utilize the solar shade for, like I said, battery storage, powering irrigation systems or fencing systems, or, I think the sky's the limit. So we're starting to move towards more of a, not a stationary model of a solar system to see what happens. Obviously, we're probably not going to have 200 kilowatts that is, movable, but from a smaller scale, which might be applicable to some farms, we're kind of moving in that direction.
Well, I'll be excited to see how that pans out. That sounds very interesting. Well, Brad, anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up here?
Sure. One thing that we've also explored, and I think some other farmers that we work with here in Minnesota are exploring, is growing crops under there. I think that's the thing. Agrivoltaics, it's not just for dairy cows. You can grow crops. So we're also exploring oats and wheat and corn and soybeans underneath solar panels. We're also working with some farmers in southern Minnesota that are growing soybeans under their solar panels. So they're even higher. Some of these people want to drive a combine underneath their solar panels. So I think there's a lot of uses when you think about agrivoltaics, and it's not just one size fits all, that we all need to do the same thing. So there's a lot of ideas out there that farmers can use, from cattle to crops with solar panels. So I think there's a lot of that stuff happening, and it's exciting to see where the future might lead us.
Most definitely. That is a perfect segue to our conversation that we're having with Ohio State and some of the work that they've been doing in cropping and solar panels. But, well, Brad, thank you so much for coming on the show and having a chat with us and telling us about your research and your experiences with dairy cows and agrivoltaics.
Thanks for inviting me. Glad to share our agrivoltaics work with anybody.
brought to you by the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension.